Go.
Thank you for joining us for the webinar, Sexual Violence Against Older Adults, Responding and Investigating to Cases of Elder Victimization. Presenting for us today, we have Chris Dubel, the Director of Training from Temple University, Harrisburg, Richard Albrecht, Investigative Specialist from the Temple University of Harrisburg, and Kayla Hauser, the Outreach Coordinator from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape.
Hi everyone, this is Chris Dubel. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This is a an issue that is one that all of us here in this room are very passionate about, and we appreciate your interest because it is one that many times gets overlooked by all of us, both in law enforcement as well as human and social services. And it's one that we believe is not going away anytime soon. And so we appreciate your involvement in this webinar, and we hope very much that you gain some insight from what we share with you today. We want to start with a case, and it's a case that I think provides us with a bit of a sober reminder as to why we're here and why this issue is so important. This woman is named Sun Kwan, and Sun was raped by a gentleman outside of a tire store. She was found by one of the employees at the tire store, essentially laying on a pile of tires with a lot of her clothes ripped off, laying there unconscious. The emergency medical services would come and take Sun to the hospital. She would survive about 6 months, but then die of pneumonia related to the injuries she sustained that day. The reason that Sun's case is so important to us is that she really teaches us that no one, regardless of age, is immune to being vulnerable to sexual violence. And in the news article that was written about this case, there's a great quote from one of the law enforcement officers, the police detective that was involved in this case. She said that she had never seen before a sexual assault victim older than about 60. Quote, "The biggest thing that struck me as being unusual about this case is that the age of the victim was extremely old. Understanding the individual that would prey upon this type of person takes the dynamic of investigating this crime to a different level." And that's why we're here, and that's why, again, we very much appreciate your time in taking this, because this is at a different level and demands some of our sharpest investigative skills when confronted with crimes of this nature. We're going to start just by touching on the sexual violence myths. I'm hoping that most of you are aware of these, but the bottom line is, as I just said, is no one is immune to sexual violence regardless of age. We have seen in our work at Temple University Harrisburg, particularly through our work at the Institute on Protective Services, which works with vulnerable adults and older adults. We have seen cases into the age of 90. And so there is there's no consideration of age. This is a crime, and it is a crime oftentimes of power and control. And it is not just a crime that is limited to women. We have seen cases of sexual violence against men. And so really what we want to just drive home with you today is everyone, regardless of age, regardless of kind of where, and we'll talk some about dementia, and we'll talk some about some cognitive issues that affect, regardless of cognitive capacity, can be a victim of sexual violence.
Hello, this is Richard. I want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the issues that we often see that can increase an individual's vulnerability to being sexually assaulted. Oftentimes with older adults, no matter the type of abuse that we see, social isolation oftentimes plays a big factor. Social isolation increases a person's vulnerability due to the the presence of manipulation and coercion, it also limits the ability of the victim to reach out for assistance. If the only person that is coming around and interacting with the older adult or the victim is the perpetrator, it's highly unlikely that that sexual assault will cease to continue. We also see older adults that have physical disabilities and cognitive disabilities that have increased vulnerabilities for sexual assault. Physical disabilities because they are less likely to be able to fend off an attacker. It's a little bit easier to physically overtake them. From a cognitive standpoint, the vulnerability increase that we see there is the fact that oftentimes somebody that has a significant cognitive impairment, such as a dementia or maybe even an intellectual disability, may not be believed as far as being a witness. The events as they report them, because of cognitive impairments, they may not be as likely to be believed, and so they are at an increased vulnerability for abuse.
This is Chris again, and again with this slide, as we talked about earlier, all of the crimes that we see across the lifespan for victims of sexual violence also occur for older adults. So we see cases of rape and indecent sexualized exposure, marital and partner rape, and I will share an example with you a little bit later. It's an issue that we're having in many nursing homes and nursing facilities and even in the community, where a couple has had a long history of sexual intimacy, and one of the partners has a cognitive capacity issue that makes their ability to consent either questionable or that they don't have the ability to consent. And so we see a lot of these situations where we're asking whether the sexual intimacy and physical intimacy between partners is actually rape. Sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, and human trafficking. And let me stop for a moment on human trafficking, because I think that this is an area that many of us still aren't fully up to speed on, and I would even say that from a national perspective. There's just not a lot of research here, but there is a growing level of evidence that older adults, and particularly older adults with some level of cognitive capacity like dementia or Alzheimer's, are victims of human and sexual trafficking. And so I don't suggest that you do this on your work computer. I just suggest that you trust us with this. But if you search terms like nursing home porn or granny porn or granny dementia porn, you will see results similar to what you're seeing on the screen right now. And this is just a sampling of dementia grandma porn, and you see that I believe that says there's almost, I can't read that far, but I believe that says there's at least about 300,000 results to just this search, and you can see some of the sampling there. One of the things, and I'm sure all of you are aware, but one of the things that we also know about the pornography industry currently is it is all about making things as real as possible. And these aren't set actors, they aren't on stage, they aren't, doing what oftentimes we associated with pornography in the 1970s and the 1980s. It is all about making these situations and scenarios as real as possible. So it's not about a stage where people are faking being in a nursing home or faking having a sexual encounter with somebody with dementia. It is about actually having that done. And so we have an increasing concern that older adults and adults with disabilities are being victims of sexual trafficking, and we believe that you, and as well as the rest of us, will be seeing cases of this as we proceed in dealing with this issue.
Okay, this is Richard again. I just want to talk about some basics of responding in investigation. So as you can see on the slide, there's a couple different facets that you want to take into consideration upon arriving on the scene. Just a couple things that I will certainly point out. The first one in securing the crime scene, certainly I would assume that you would be familiar with steps that you could take to do that. But one thing that I think we want to point out, especially in cases where you're responding to an alleged sexual assault at a long-term care facility, a personal care home, a nursing home, assisted living, is the time sensitivity of responding and collecting of that physical evidence. Oftentimes in facilities, they have staff housekeeping, and so oftentimes what we will see is that when an alleged incident has occurred, one of the things that the facility wants to do, more from a hygiene standpoint, is to collect some of those linens and start to wash them, and not truly understanding the fact that they are destroying physical evidence or potential physical evidence that could be there. So if you are arriving at a facility, ensuring that nobody has access to that room, that way something can inadvertently be removed and potentially destroyed. Some additional steps that we would suggest is contacting the local area agency on aging's protective services unit. They can be a wealth of information to investigators. They can assist in co-investigations. And they can also offer assistance in conducting interviews, collecting information, because that is one of their roles when an older adult is suspected of being abused, is coming in and conducting an investigation from their perspective. Obviously, if the victim requests it, ensuring that there are resources available to the victim and making sure that those resources have been set up.
Another area that we need to look at is the physical assessment of that older adult. And again, a lot of the symptoms can be the same, but really what we really want you to take away from this is anything that can be unexplained, that we don't just write off as unexplained, and that we really do an examination as to, and we'll talk about interviewing here shortly, making sure that we are interviewing for all possibilities, including that there may have been sexual violence perpetrated against this older adult. Some of the common signs that you see on this slide, one of those that is major flag for us is the bilateral bruising, especially on those inner thighs. One of the things that you'll hear both with older adults living in the community or in nursing homes is they bruise easily. That could be true, and there are times that people do bruise easily, but it's much more challenging to get bruising in that bilateral form on those inner thighs, sometimes on the inner arms. Doesn't automatically mean that they were assaulted, but it is certainly a flag that would indicate to us that we want to be asking some very specific questions about how they may have, how those bruises may have come about. The other one on this slide that I want you to pay attention to is the unexplained infections and sexually transmitted diseases. And part of this for me is I just reviewed a case a couple months ago where a woman, probably in her 70s, was living with two gentlemen. She had gone to the doctor, and the doctor had diagnosed her with a sexually transmitted disease. When in the physician's office, when she was asked about whether she was having any sexual relationships, she said she had not since her husband had died 10 years ago. That was the last of the documentation in this case about the sexually transmitted disease. It was almost like it was just another illness that she had on her list of diagnoses. There was no follow-up. There was no asking. So making sure that when we see infections that aren't explained, like urinary tract infections or sexually transmitted diseases, that we're asking that very logical question of how would have they gotten this if they are not sexually active? And again, it's a sign that we make sure we ask the right questions and we probe a little deeper during our interview process and perhaps even more specific with our questions to make sure we cover that area that is unexplained.
All right, this is Kayla, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about obtaining medical care and what that might look like for someone. And we always encourage in a medical evaluation whether or not someone receives a forensic rape exam. So a lot of times older adults may have more serious injuries than younger survivors. Due to those they're more likely to have internal injuries, more likely to need to be hospitalized even. So you want to make sure that we're following through with that. Sometimes there's a move to not want that person to be seen by a doctor or have a forensic rape exam because we don't want to upset the family, we don't want to re-traumatize an older adult. But kind of weighing some of those medical risks should be considered. A little bit about the forensic rape exam. We do have sexual assault nurse examiners in Pennsylvania throughout the Commonwealth at different hospitals who are specially trained to provide forensic rape exams to victims, and some of them are specially trained to work with our older adults or other special populations. And we should know that those exams are there to collect forensic evidence that we may not see, kind of with our eyes. So, it's important to know that folks can consent to all or pieces of an exam. So, if the older adult you're working with is worried about a particular piece of the exam, know that they can choose not to do that. And know that those nurses are trained to take lots of breaks or go at a pace that fits for the survivor they're working with, and kind of they're specially trained to kind of be mindful of the trauma that the person just may have experienced. And also, just because someone participates in a forensic rape exam does not mean that law enforcement is automatically involved in that case. The survivor has some time afterwards to decide whether or not that's something they would like for themselves. Forensic rape exams in Pennsylvania are free to the victim and the victim's family. They should not be charged. They should not be responsible for that medical bill either. So just a little bit about those type of exams.
And this is Richard again, kind of circling back to securing the scene. Of course, we want to do a walkthrough of the area where the alleged incident has occurred, but I would suggest also taking that a step farther and, if you're responding to a home in the community, walking through the entire house or the entire facility, because you're looking to see if evidence has moved, physical evidence, if there's bed linens, torn pieces of clothing, articles, things of that nature that would lead to some credence to the allegation or suspected assault. We want to make sure that we're able to locate that. If we're responding to issues in the facility, there's some certain records that we would certainly suggest you attempt to obtain. Any of the documentation or progress notes from the medical staff, physicians, nurses, nurse aides, turn and position log sheets, care plans, medication and treatment records, and then all communication documentation from staff as well. Oftentimes what you see is there's pass-along logs between different shifts. These facilities are operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and not all communication ends up in official format. Oftentimes nurses' aides carry around mini notebooks that they can keep notes in. They will print out an older adult's care plan or a specific wing's care plan that lists many older adults, and they'll take their own personal notes on there and pass along notes that way. A lot of that documentation, though, you are going to get from the facility itself. But something that we are starting to see come on the rise a little bit more is issues of explicit photography being taken and posted to social media. Some nursing homes are taking the steps that are banning, per policy, their employees from carrying cell phones while on the floor providing direct care, but a lot of facilities still allow their staff to carry their own personal cell phones. And so, as you can see on the screen, and if you put that into a Google search, you will see numerous incidences of nursing home or personal care home staff that are taking pictures of residents in compromising situations and then sharing that, posting it on social media, sharing it with friends. So making sure that we check those avenues for appropriate evidence as well is going to be vitally important. So the next thing that you want to do after you've ensured that the older adult is safe and that the crime scene is secure, determining your interview list. And it's going to be based upon the location of the alleged assault. You're probably going to have a slightly more extensive interview list in a facility because there are so many individuals that have interaction with the older adult. But one of the big things that I think that people need to understand, or investigators need to understand, is that, we have to understand the information that we are obtaining from each of our witnesses or each of the people that we interview. They're going to be able to provide us specific types of information. So family members, friends, things of that nature, that's going to be more personal information, whereas medical staff are going to be providing information that is more medically based. When you are talking with, maybe the nurse's aides or the nursing staff and reviewing some of that medical documentation, as Chris said earlier, you want to look for things that are unexplained, unusual changes in behavior, and oftentimes what we can see, especially with somebody, an older adult that's been victimized, is that they have a reluctance to allow personal care to be performed upon them, whether that's incontinence care, somebody being incontinent of bowel and bladder, they are now resisting staff to be able to clean them up, or even bathing. We see a number of cases where victims of sexual assault now refuse to be bathed or be taken into an isolated area such as a bathroom, and have that staff member perform personal care on them. So, kind of understanding those changes in behaviors and what that may be a sign or symptom of.
This is Chris, and I want to talk a little bit about interviewing the victim. One of the things that is of a concern to us is that at times we see that the victim never gets to tell their story and is never asked. And we would just strongly encourage everyone, always make sure you make contact with that victim. And one of the things that you will oftentimes hear both from people who are actively trying to cover something up, but also people who think they're acting in the best interest of that victim is, oh, it would upset them for you to talk to them, or they're not able to communicate. And the term that you will often hear is nonverbal. I never believe that someone can't communicate until I've tried to communicate with them myself, because there have been many times where I've been told people can't communicate, and they actually can. Sometimes they can even communicate verbally, but other times they've been able to communicate through signing something to me or making physical gestures that give me a sense of what may have happened to them. We also want to understand a little bit about the changes in the aging brain, and as I think all of you know, that could take up hours of time. But there are things that are going on in our aging brain, and I'll give you one example. One is, as we get older, we tend to struggle with what we call episodic memory. And episodic memory is our ability to remember things from front to back, from a time period at the start to the time period at the end. So oftentimes when we're doing investigations, we ask somebody, we say to them, please start at the beginning and tell me exactly what happened. That's going to be really tough for some of our folks who are older adults because their memory is not thinking in that same way. So making sure that we're asking questions at different points of time. You can still start with that question, but if you see someone struggling with that question, don't give up on them. Say, okay, well, can you tell me the last thing that you remember? Or when do you usually get your bath? Other clues that you might have about the case that may jog their memory are very important. And you may have to spend a little bit of a longer period of time talking with that older adult than you may with other witnesses. Appreciating the generational differences in explanations of an act. Remember that the terms that we use regarding sex are not universal terms. There was one case many years ago that I'm familiar with where the investigators spent a lot of time asking the older adult whether she had been sexually victimized. And every time they used the word sex in their questioning. And she said no, 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 and continued to say no. It was only when one of the investigators asked a very specific question of, did someone put their penis into your mouth when you didn't want them to, that she said yes. And we may say, well, why didn't she put that in the context of sex? Not sure, but she didn't. And so making sure that we don't just assume that our terms hold universal meaning, but that we ask very specific questions about what may have happened to them. Thinking through the best times to interview. All of us are familiar with the concept of sundowning, when people may be alert at the first part of the day, but then towards the afternoon start to lack the capacity or lack the ability to communicate. So we want to make sure that we are timing things and doing our interviews where that person is going, their capacity to remember is going to be at the highest peak. Also thinking through, especially for some of your facility investigations, but also in the community, what's going on at that time. If lunchtime at XYZ nursing home is always at 12 o'clock, and if you don't get there at 12 o'clock, your food's going to be cold by 12:30. Doing an interview at 11:59 is probably not going to get the best results. So being aware of the different times and strategizing about how do I go about best getting the most information. I think we're going to talk a little bit about utilizing trauma-informed interviewing as well when working with older adults.
All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about trauma-informed interviewing, what that really means is just being mindful of what the impact of trauma has on an individual. Older adults, any survivor can experience trauma from an assault. So this is really a kind of a universal precaution. Just because someone is an older adult doesn't mean that they were not traumatized from what's happened to them. So this is really working with what we know about trauma. So some of the things that looks like is acknowledge the victim's pain and trauma. Simply saying this, this might be difficult for you to be here. I appreciate you being here, taking that time for them just to kind of express what's happened to them, and create a safe space as much as you can. What that might look like is seeing where the survivor might feel comfortable with the interview, the proximity of the perpetrator, and that means psychological safety as well as physical safety. Perhaps this, there could be a number of things that could be on their mind about their immediate safety that could be impacting their interview, so being mindful of those things as well. Making them as comfortable as possible can really be about building a rapport. Spend a little bit of time getting to know them as much as you can, making them feel comfortable in that way. Sometimes the subject matter can be challenging for anyone, especially older adults. So giving time and space to let them be comfortable with you. So it might take a little bit of time to get to the questions that you really want. To be an effective interviewer, I would encourage you to move slowly and build that relationship a little bit. And convey empathy, and that can be as simply as, I'm sorry this happened to you, and really being present with them. Use your active listening skills, and those things like open body language, summarizing what they've said to you, nodding, encouraging, or some types of active listening skills. Use affirmative messaging as much as you can. Again, like that nodding, kind of, you're encouraging what they're saying. And I would encourage you also to resist jumping into problem solving because we're in the helping field. So often we want to fix or take care of whatever might be happening to them. But as we know, sometimes the trauma response, we're not quite sure what's the best path for them. So really just listening and being present for that time is really important. And also being upfront. So, we want to be realistic about what's happening to them, especially when we're working with older adults. Sometimes we want to minimize what's happened or not quite tell them the whole situation about their options or what might be happening through the civil or criminal spaces. So we want to be upfront, helping survivors understand fully what's going on in their case or what might happen next can help them gauge their safety. So I really encourage that. And know that this can be a time for validation too. So even if we can't ensure that everything will go in their case the way that they want to, we could acknowledge, like I said, that victim's trauma and pain, and it can be a time for validation. And then when you're moving into questioning or talking, working with the survivor, some of the ways that interview techniques can complement trauma or understanding how trauma works in the brain is to ask open-ended questions. So we want to give folks the opportunity to respond. As Chris said, sometimes it's difficult to start from the beginning of an event and go to the end, not only because someone's an older adult, but also because of the way the brain and body responds to trauma. What is more promising is asking questions that respond and elicit the memories using the 5 senses. During a traumatic incident, these 5 senses are heightened, so when you were asking questions about them, a lot of times that's a really great way for memory recall. The questions around the 5 W's can be challenging for folks because they require a specific answer, and sometimes when we can't remember questions and we're not able to do that, it can really shut down an interview. Survivors really want to be able to tell you what's happened to them, but a lot of times, they're just not able to remember certain pieces. So those questions that require an answer can be really challenging when they don't remember. So those open-ended questions can really be your friend. And also those questions that elude blame, whether we mean to or not, questions like why didn't you or why did you do this? Though we don't mean to, a lot of times that can make a victim feel like we're blaming them for what's happened. So leaning on those open-ended questions, questions like can you tell me about what you remember, can be really helpful for helping them to tell you what's happened. And then the last piece here is if you do need follow-up or clarifying questions, we want to wait till the end. A lot of times when folks are able to recall memory, those interruptions can make them not be able to tell you the whole piece of what's happened. Realize that questions can be triggering, and what that means is they may feel like they're actually reliving the event, and all those emotions and physiological responses might come along with it. So, don't take that personally, and if you need to, make time for space and breaks and things like that to help them through the interview process. Leave them with next steps and referrals. Know that you're there for a point in time and really aren't there to provide emotional support. So making sure that they know what can happen next and all their options. Really important is not making promises you cannot keep, such as, we'll find the perpetrator, they're going to go to jail, this will never happen to you again. Again, though that's well-meaning and well-intentioned, a lot of times that can give folks a false sense of security, and we really want them to be able to assess their own safety. And then also the last piece there going along with referrals is we want to make sure that we're connecting to them with someone who can talk to them about their assault. So whether that's right after your interview or in the future, really connecting them with local sexual assault or rape crisis services can be a really great way to make sure that they have someone to connect with after you leave.
So I also want to talk a little bit about interviewing alleged perpetrators. And the main thing I want to take off this slide is this is the type of interview that you will be doing that's going to demand your best skills. Talking with a friend who does investigations, he put it this way. He said, not many people want to admit to doing sexual violence against an older adult. It's just not something that people are going to readily confess to. And so it's really about being patient. This is rarely the interview that's going to just take a few minutes with that alleged perpetrator. And as all of you know, that alleged perpetrator is watching all of your nonverbal cues as an interviewer to see how much they can trust to share with you. And so the moment they see you start to react, and they're probably going to test you with a few things about that are going to be unrelated to the sexual violence, like, I mean, this sounds, but I lied to my grandmother once, and they're looking for how you react to those little small admissions of other things to kind of judge whether they're going to tell you more. So it really involves your patience, and as in any sexual violence crime, being able to sit there and listen patiently through the details. Unfortunately, some of these details are going to be very graphic in nature, and it's going to really involve us sitting there calmly and letting that person walk through the details of their specific case or their specific incident. Then we get to our million-dollar issue of consent. Consent is a tough one for us, for older adults, and I'll explain why, but let me set some parameters for consent. First of all, nothing that we have talked about in the course of this module says that older adults can't be involved in sexual relationships. They absolutely can be. We encourage that. But it must be done on a consensual basis. And so as you see on this slide, it gives some of the parameters for consent. That consent means a willful and positive cooperation in an act, which includes voluntary action and knowledge of the act involved. So someone that does not have cognitive capacity cannot willfully and in a positive cooperation in the act. Consent is specific to each individual act. Consent cannot be induced by force, duress, or deception, and there are no specific words to signify consent. And very importantly, and we see this in some of our cases with older adults, consent can be withdrawn at any time. And so for example, in a facility case, someone can agree to some level of physical or sexual intimacy with another resident. But at the moment that they say no, at the moment that they withdraw that capacity, anything after that is a form of sexual violence. So we want to be very, very aware of, did this person consent, and did they have the cognitive capacity to consent? And so on the next slide here, you will see it is a case that brings this issue to the forefront. This is actually a Iowa State Representative, Henry Rahans. At age 78, he was arrested and an attempt to prosecute him for rape of his wife. His wife did not have the cognitive capacity to consent. The nursing facility where she lived had told him that he could not any longer engage in sexual intimacy with his wife. The allegations were that he continued to. In full disclosure, he was found not guilty of this crime, but it set off kind of this national conversation of these two people who had, from all accounts of people that testified in the case, a physical and sexual relationship throughout their marriage. Some people said, well, shouldn't that be able to continue for him? Our point to you today is, once she lacked the capacity, once she lacked the cognitive capacity to consent, that's sexual violence. And again, he was found not guilty, don't know all the elements of the case, but it is something that we need to be very aware of, especially when we're dealing with people who we're concerned about have an issue with cognitive capacity. We're not asking you to become experts, neuropsychologists or anything like that, but when you have a concern, it is very appropriate as law enforcement to get a referral to have that person be evaluated for their cognitive capacity to consent to a sexual interaction with someone else.
And this is Richard again. We're going to start to talk about some resources and collaboration to help support these types of investigations from a variety of different fronts. Some of my past experience comes from the older adult protective services area, and so that would be one of the first resources that I would suggest reaching out to when it comes to older adults that are victimized. They can provide support to the investigating officer in the investigation. As I said before, if the Area Agency on Aging is made aware of a situation, they'll go out and conduct an investigation. They'll have more the focus of ensuring the safety of the older adult or the victim, whereas your focus may be more on evidence collection. But still working in tandem with those two, having a co-investigation, another set of eyes can be extremely important. Additionally, the protective services staff may have an existing knowledge of the victim, whether that person be in a facility or in the community. They may have an understanding of some of those dynamics that may come into play. They'll have an existing knowledge of family members, or if they've had numerous incidences that were reported to them in this specific facility, that may be information that's vital to your investigation. Additionally, one thing that protective services staff are uniquely equipped to do is interview older adults, specifically older adults that have cognitive capacity issues. That is pretty much the brunt of the population that they interview. So when they conduct their investigations, they have extensive experience in interviewing older adults who may have been victimized in some form or fashion. So if you're struggling with collecting some information or getting a lot of details from an older adult, it may be permissible for you to contact Protective Services at the local Area Agency on Aging to get some support. As you can see on the slide, there is a statewide hotline, and that will help direct you to the particular Area Agency on Aging for the jurisdiction that you are in.
And then I'm just going to let you know about some victim resources that are available throughout the Commonwealth. Rape crisis services are available in every single county in Pennsylvania. They can provide court, medical, and legal accompaniment, so they can support folks through all those processes. They can provide crisis intervention in the immediate, and then long and short-term counseling in group and individual settings. So sometimes they're able to come out to where the older adult is, or sometimes they only have services within their facility. But they also can give some information about victims' compensation. They do provide a hotline that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That is free and confidential. Many of the resources also provide prevention education. So if you want to work with them collaboratively on cross-training or understanding both systems, that would be a great avenue. And then lastly, at the bottom is the phone number to call to be connected to your local rape crisis center in your area.
We want to end. We've talked a lot about kind of the people who are victims, but we want to end with a story about a survivor. She may be one of my new heroes. Her name is Amelia Rudolph. Unfortunately, we learn about Amelia because she had lived in her home that she and her husband had built. She lived there for over 60 years. Her husband had passed away. One night she woke up and went to the bathroom, and as she was going to the bathroom, she saw that there was someone in her home, and that she could see that the door had been broken into. Turned out the person in her home was a 17-year-old neighbor who would go on to rape Ms. Rudolph. Ms. Rudolph describes her feelings immediately after, and the couple days after, as feeling like she didn't want anybody to know. She says she felt dirty, she felt ashamed, she felt like it may have been her fault. And she struggled with a lot of the same feelings that people who survive sexual violence feel. But what I think is really cool for all of us as part of this story is she describes kind of the moment that turns her perspective on it. And she says, quote, "I didn't want anybody to know at first, but after we got the policemen here, they helped me. I think going public will help other people." So for those of you listening that are in law enforcement, you represent a critical piece for people who survive this. For Amelia, that helped her to go public. And then later on, her favorite football team, for the sports fans out there, the Indianapolis Colts, she would meet Andrew Luck, her favorite player. But it was a lot because of that first reaction of law enforcement. And if that first reaction wouldn't have been there, we don't know if Amelia would ever want to tell her story. And that goes not only for those listening in law enforcement, but victim services, human services, whatever area that you come to this call from. We really encourage you that our reactions, our first reactions to victims and survivors of sexual violence, are some of the most important and can make a huge difference. And thankfully, in this case, Amelia was greeted by police that listened to her, empowered her, and gave her hope. And she is speaking out and has said that she hopes that if a 93-year-old can speak out about it, that will help younger victims as well. So thank you very much for listening to us today. And if you would like more information, our information is there. Please email Kayla, Chris, or Kayla, myself. I didn't mean to talk about myself in the third person, or Richard. Please reach out to us. We are happy to answer questions. We are happy to provide consultation the best we can. Again, thank you for participating in the call. And lastly,
well, on behalf of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, I would like to extend my gratitude to our presenters, Chris Dubel, Richard Albrecht, and Kayla Hauser. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, and we know that the audience has found it helpful.